This video is on Sartre's Being and Nothingness, Part 1, Chapter 1, The Origin of Negation. In my first video of this series, I briefly touched upon Hegel's master-slave dialectic. This prepares us to look at human relations in terms of a subject and an object. We make sense of this when we relate it to everyday reality, in the distinctions we make when we use the word me or the word I. I am a subject when I act upon the world in some way. Conversely, I am an object when something or someone acts upon me. We make these conceptions intelligible by relating them to common parlance, by relating the subject to the I, and by relating the object to the me. We gather an immediate sense of these terms and allows us to have a more fluid understanding of the text. So, since we're covering negation, let's look at the words no, never, nobody, and nothing, all of which correspond to negation. They are also very often replies to questions we ask, and questions that are asked of us. And that's how Sartre begins Part 1, Chapter 1, The Origin of Negation. He begins it with the question. To answer a question with a no, or with any negation, is to acknowledge the non-existence of something. The distinction between the words never and nobody, while they're both examples of negations, they engage with different structures of our consciousness, different structures of the for itself. Never engages with our temporality. Nobody is a negation of another transcendent being, another transcendence. And nothingness, as we will see, is the being of the negation. A couple questions relevant to this chapter would be, what does it mean to acknowledge the non-existence of something? Is non-being real, or is it imagined as a creation of consciousness? And this question fits into a broader question, which is simply, what is the relation between being and non-being? These are the issues that Sartre deals with in this chapter, and he will elaborate on them in chapters to come. He examines Hegel's dialectical concept of nothingness and Heidegger's phenomenological concept of nothingness. Sartre uses these conceptions to build to a more specific description of nothingness, of non-being. Early on in the chapter, Sartre distinguishes an abstraction from concrete reality. An abstraction isolates a property from its manifestation in a concrete reality. An abstraction isolates a property that depends on something else in order for it to manifest through, like a color. A color is an abstraction because it always belongs to a being as a feature of that being. The color blue is an abstraction because we have isolated it from the blue sky, or her blue eyes, or the blue house. Blue needs something concrete to exist through, and this follows with any abstraction. This helps us describe the nothingness that is our consciousness. And ultimately, this is the main point of the chapter, because in order to identify anything, to differentiate anything, we need abstraction. We situate ourselves in reality by differentiating the objects from each other and from ourselves. This requires us to understand the properties that differentiate them. As we recognize these properties, we abstract them. Our consciousness surrounds them with nothingness. The way our conception of blue, as it is by itself, floats in the nothingness that is our consciousness, when it is without a concrete object to manifest its reality through. This will help us understand how Sartre's view of nothingness differs from Hegel and his dialectical concept of nothingness. Hegel establishes being as the most all-encompassing description. For Hegel, being is the indetermination which precedes all determination, the undetermined as the absolute point of departure. The only thing we could say about it is that it is identical with itself. Therefore, it is not excluding anything. Being on its own is continuous and general, and its definition is so broad that it is empty. Anything and everything can fit into it, as it, because being alone includes everything. It has no particular content that can be broken off to set in relation to the whole. It is the whole. Being is everything, and for Hegel, this means that it coincides with nothing. It has no limiting criteria, and so it may contain everything. It is everything and therefore nothing. Its generality is its emptiness. Its emptiness is non-being. Both being and non-being are driven to the absolute, and they find each other in the absolute. When we think of why being and non-being unite for Hegel, we can make some sense of it by referring back to how Sartre describes abstract from concrete reality. If we think of abstraction in degrees, we can trace our descriptions further into generality. For example, I could take any object, the table in front of me. I could abstract the table in an infinite number of directions, all of which unite in being. I could say that it is made from a particular kind of tree, which fits into a larger abstraction when I say that it is wood, which can be absorbed again on the level of matter when I say that it is carbon, and so on. All of these descriptions, all of the possible abstractions for any and every particular object dissolve and become absorbed in being. The essence of the table as a table lies in human reality. Its being in itself is never apprehended as a table. On the level of being, the table is absorbed in total undifferentiation with its surroundings. What was a table is now only being. Its being as the table has been annihilated, because we have abstracted it further than its use value as a table, and we have abstracted it further than its material composition. We have remained attached to it only in our consciousness of it as there and not me. And by doing this, we acknowledge its being as separate from our own. The internal negation is there, it's not me. This separation, this cleavage, is nothingness. It is there and it is not me. Nothingness surrounds us. This nothingness is our consciousness, puncturing through the totality of being. Sartre writes, "To oppose being to nothingness as thesis and antithesis, as Hegel does, is to suppose that they are logically contemporary." Sartre continues, "Non-being is not the opposite of being, it is its contradiction." So Hegel believes that being and non-being as abstractions are equally empty. But for Sartre, Hegel forgets that non-being must be empty of something. And so the distinction between being and non-being does not create the conceptual symmetry that is implied by Hegel. Explaining one doesn't explain the other. Rather, being takes a logical precedence over non-being. Non-being is a denial of being. Sartre writes, "Being is prior to nothingness and establishes the ground for it." Sartre brings us closer to his conception of non-being with Heidegger in his phenomenological concept of nothingness. For Heidegger, nothingness is produced by human reality. It is produced by human consciousness, and that comes close to what Sartre says about it, except with Sartre, consciousness is nothingness. It doesn't produce it, it is it. Consciousness is what it is consciousness of. It is intentional. It is supported by what it is directed at, and so it is defined by the content existing outside of it. In this way, consciousness is nothing. It is a void. It is a hole in being, and since we receive everything through our consciousness as consciousness, we have non-being always available in everything and anything. Non-being comes packaged with being. They are inextricably linked, because being is what our consciousness is consciousness of, and our consciousness differentiates among being. It breaks off the continuity of being through annihilation. Differentiating objects from within being requires negation. One must use negation in order to differentiate objects from each other and the totality of being which they are set in. If we are to perceive a cup, then we must understand that the cup is not part of the table. It is not one with the table. Sartre refers to this as an external negation. So, with Heidegger, human reality gives us negation, but with Sartre, negation gives us human reality, because non-being is already at the heart of being, coiled in there like a worm, as Sartre writes. This is an easy detail to hear once and kind of disregard, but it's crucial. Consciousness is nothingness. It does not create nothingness because nothingness is fundamental to it. It cannot create nothingness if nothingness is already integral to what it is. So we see how negations delve into the structures of consciousness, our temporality, our being for others, and we begin to develop a sense of consciousness of the for itself as enveloped by nothingness, enveloped in nothingness rather, surrounded by it. Nothingness separates us from the world and from the objects and other transcendent beings around us. Sartre is saying that non-being is real, that it is not simply something consciousness creates. If it is only something that consciousness makes, then it is merely a judgment. Sartre uses the word psychic to describe this merely positive affirmation of facts, something that exists entirely in the mind of the subject and is not reality in itself. So you will see Sartre defining his stance on non-being as explaining it to be more than merely a judgment. It has an objective reality. Sartre demonstrates the reality of non-being with his famous scenario of meeting Pierre at a cafe. You have an appointment with Pierre at a particular cafe at a certain time. Sartre asks, I arrive at the cafe late. Will Pierre have waited for me? So again, we go back to the question as fundamental to nothingness. There is a question about possibilities here. Will Pierre be there or not? So there is a readiness to identify Pierre. The fact that Pierre is not there is not simply a negative judgment. If it is only a negative judgment, then the negation is entirely a psychic phenomena and has no objective reality. But since the negation manifests as more than a judgment, it leads us to recognize the existence of non-being as a reality, as bound up with being. When we look for Pierre, we scan the environment, negating all that is not Pierre. We search for a figure standing in relief against the ground of the environment. So already there is a negation of the environment. Now, Pierre's absence is separate from the negation of the cafe. As we are looking for Pierre, we are negating the ground that is the environment. All the activity of people and objects is a ground in which Pierre is about to appear on. As we scan our eyes over it, specific objects and people become isolated in our field of vision for just a moment as we negate the presence of Pierre in them. They then dissolve back into undifferentiation. They recede back into the environment, all of which is negated in the search for Pierre. Sartre writes, if I should finally discover Pierre, my intuition would be filled by a solid element. I should be suddenly arrested by his face, and the whole cafe would organize itself around him as a discrete presence. This absence, this non-being, serves as foundation for the judgment. Pierre is not here. This absence is seen as objectively real, because from the standpoint of phenomenology, our perceptions of things is all that we have. Reality is disclosed to us as an appearance. Sartre writes, I myself expected to see Pierre, and my expectation has caused the absence of Pierre to happen as a real event concerning this cafe. It is an objective fact at present that I have discovered this absence, and it presents itself as a synthetic relation between Pierre and the setting in which I am looking for him. Sartre refers to Pierre's absence as haunting the cafe. His absence colors the entire situation, and this is what is real about it. Sartre gives another interesting example before I finish up this video, and it has to do with anticipation. Suppose I open my wallet to find 1,300 francs in it, because we're in France, obviously. We establish this by affirming the reality of what we count. It is the original judgment, a merely positive affirmation. This, however, could be followed by another realization. Suppose I expected there to be 1,500 francs in my wallet. In this moment, I am confronting non-being. If there were only positive judgments concerning reality, then I would not have the experience of losing money, the experience of feeling the non-existence of money. The absence of these 200 francs is a real event in the world, one that we can easily relate to. So I'll stop it here and finish up this chapter next time, where I'll discuss anguish and bad faith. If you enjoy this video, if you found it helpful, please like and subscribe to my channel.